I wanted to touch on Linux a little bit more because it's amazing to me. There's lots and lots of Windows advocates out there bashing OS 10 and Apple all day long. Apple this, Apple sucks, OS 10 sucks, so on and so forth. And then yet overnight they become Linux users. So they're putting up all this stuff for Windows this is great and all that, and then the next day after a few comments or response videos they're Linux users. So it's like a self-defeating argument. What the heck was the whole point of putting up the Windows if you're not really going to defend it and retreat to using Linux as a defense? So that said, I wanted to touch on Linux. As I've said before, I have a few of the flavors of it, distros, whatever you want to call it, from Red Hat to SUSE to Ubuntu to the GUI Linspire, so on and so forth. And I think that's really the issue with Linux, is there's so many flavors. I'm not one to stifle the quest to find the best OS and taking a kernel and doing the best you can with it. But as far as mainstream, and before anybody starts, yeah, I'm very familiar with all the Linux server applications, all the ISPs out there that have it. But if we're going to talk about the consumer side, which most of our arguments are based upon, at least as far as the demonstration videos and so forth, Linux needs to consolidate. This whole concept of free, which it really isn't, but this whole concept of costing nothing and oh, I can get this and that at no cost. Well, I'm a programmer. Programming pays my bills. And open versus closed, I'm going to be more of an advocate for intellectual property protection, because I'm a firm believer that there has to be a core product. There has to be a core definition. Not create a definition and then have everybody else create the same exact definition. I think too much of that, you lose sight of building upon the one definition. So as far as I'm concerned, there has to be a line drawn in the sand where Linux has to say, this is my core product, this is the definition of my product, and we're going to build upon this. And this much of it is going to be open so that we can encourage other vendors to build upon what we have built. But nobody's going to touch our core product. And it's ours, and that's what defines us as a business. Now, there are models out there that I myself have worked with where the revenue comes in from support. But to get into at least to the retail consumer side outside of the whole Linux server argument, you have to have, Linux has to have a larger logistical chain of software supplier vendors that feel comfortable about investing in developing for Linux. I mean, if I were a third-party software provider and I see all these versions of Linux, what am I going to do? I got to pick one out of the 10 that exist to build my product for. Now, granted, if I build it for one, it will likely run on the others. But if we're going to really beef these distros of Linux up and have a core to where we don't have some of the issues like I myself am having with finding drivers. It's stable when you don't tinker with it, but it's nowhere near as friendly for consumers than OS 10 or even Windows in some regards. So we need more of that core definition of this is the Linux issue that we have chosen, and yes, more of it's going to become proprietary, and because of that, we're going to dedicate more of our resources to it, and then third-party software vendors will say, yeah, fine. Now I see some stability in terms of a business model, and I'm going to build for that, and before we know it, we're going to have an OEM Linux varieties out there competing, at least on the retail side and consumer side, against Apple and the Windows clones and OEM vendors, and that's something that I'm all for, more competition. But for now, I'm seeing some development on the server side. I'm not going to go on the server side, but at least for consumer use, playing applications and programming, I would love to have more support and not have to go out to forums and get a community helping each other, but really not having a whole true solution. So it's likely going to happen one day, and I think Microsoft blew it with Vista, but who knows? We'll see what they do in the future. But Linux and Apple have a real opportunity. All the vendors do, when the leader is down, and I think they should take advantage of that and start building some serious market forces to put it into people's homes and giving them a viable option to compete against OS 10 and so forth. And I think that's just it. One of the beauties that I love about OS 10 is that there's no let's use Leopard that's coming out in a few weeks. There's no Leopard Home Edition. There's no Leopard Premium Edition, Leopard Ultimate Edition, Enterprise Edition, so on and so forth. There's none of this. Leopard is Leopard. Let's have Ubuntu is Ubuntu. That's our core product. Nobody's going to touch the closed sections of Ubuntu, but let's build. These parts are open. Let's encourage market forces to come in and start supplying applications for our OS Ubuntu. Boom. Instead of having every Tom, Dick, and Harry go out there and say, well, you know what, I'm not really an Ubuntu fan, I'm going to go build my own. And again, there's sort of a contradiction with that, because you don't want to stifle the quest to create more, but at least for a business and the argument to satisfy, let's get Linux boxes into people's homes, you need to meet some of that criteria. Getting back to the whole YouTube debate with Mac versus PC, it's just hilarious how I see all these Windows advocates. Again, oh well, I use Linux. Whatever. I mean, it's completely a self-defeating argument. So I just find it amusing. That's really the short version of my opinions on Linux. I will continue to develop for Linux. I do have some applications out there, but those are my hiccups with it. It is not a perfect OS by any means. It's got a lot of open hole problems with drivers, especially going with some specific hardware, like what I'm trying to do with some of my thin clients, getting them out to the TVs and programming. What would they be the equivalent to APIs or threads? APIs on the Windows side, but threads out to some, like I've got clients out in the steel industry, trying to communicate with a lot of the heat sensor valves and stuff like that. So there's still a ways to go with Linux, and that's really what my opinion, shortened version of it is. So to all you window advocates out there that retreat to Linux, defend Windows, stick with Windows, and let it be that. Thanks for watching.